I always thought my wife, Emily, and I had a good thing going. Sure, we had our ups and downs, but who doesn't after 10 years of marriage? It wasn't perfect, but it was ours. We had a rhythm, work, dinner, helping our son with homework, the occasional date night. Life was predictable, maybe even a little boring at times, but it was comfortable. Or so I thought. It all started on a regular Thursday evening. I'd been working late shifts for weeks, trying to close a deal that would set us up for the next few years. Emily had been unusually understanding about my long hours, even encouraging me to keep pushing through. "It's for us, honey," she'd say, with that supportive smile that always melted my stress away. That night, I wrapped up early, hoping to surprise her. I even picked up her favorite takeout on the way home, a rare treat since we'd been trying to save money. When I got home, the house was quiet. Too quiet. Normally, Emily would be in the kitchen or lounging on the couch with our son, laughing about some silly cartoon they were watching. Instead, the place felt off. I called out, but no one answered. I found our son, Dylan, already asleep in his room. That wasn't too unusual, but Emily's absence was. Her car wasn't in the driveway, and she hadn't mentioned going anywhere. I texted her, asterisk, "Hey, where are you? Got your favorite Thai food." Asterisk, she didn't reply. Hours ticked by. I tried not to overthink it, but something about the silence started gnawing at me. Emily was the type to check in, even if it was just a quick "be home soon." My mind went to dark places. Was she okay? Was there an accident? I called her phone. It rang, but she didn't pick up. Then, a strange thought crossed my mind. What if she wasn't alone? I brushed it off at first. Emily wasn't like that. She loved me. We had a kid, a life. But the longer the silence dragged on, the louder that nagging doubt became. I decided to track her phone. I know, it sounds paranoid, but at that moment, I needed answers more than I cared about respecting her privacy. The app showed her location about 10 miles away, parked on a quiet side street I didn't recognize. My heart dropped. Why would she be there? My hands shook as I grabbed my keys and drove out. It felt like my stomach was in my throat the whole way there. Every worst-case scenario flashed through my mind, but I still clung to the hope that there was some logical explanation. When I got close, I turned off my headlights and parked a block away. I walked toward the location on foot, trying to keep calm, trying to convince myself I was overreacting. That's when I saw her. Emily was in the back seat of a taxi, parked under a dim streetlight. I froze. I wanted to believe maybe she was just catching a ride home. Maybe her car broke down, maybe. But then I saw him, the driver, a tall, broad-shouldered guy who looked nothing like me. They weren't just sitting there. They were kissing. No, not just kissing. It was intense, passionate, like they'd been starving for each other. My heart shattered into a million pieces. I couldn't breathe. My fists clenched, and for a moment, I thought about storming up to the car and ripping that guy out of the driver's seat. But I didn't. I couldn't. Instead, I stood there, hidden in the shadows, watching as my wife, the woman I built my life with, betrayed me right in front of my eyes. I don't know how long I stood there. It could have been seconds or hours. Time didn't feel real anymore. Finally, they stopped. She climbed out of the car, adjusted her dress, and kissed him one last time before heading toward a nearby house. I wanted to scream, to run up and confront her, but I couldn't move. My legs felt like they were made of lead. The taxi driver pulled away, leaving me standing alone on that dark street, my world crumbling around me. Eventually, I forced myself to walk back to my car. The drive home was a blur. I couldn't think, couldn't feel anything but this hollow, aching pain in my chest. By the time I got back, Emily was already there, sitting on the couch like nothing had happened. "Hey, you're home early," she said casually, like she hadn't just destroyed everything we had. I didn't answer. I couldn't. I just stared at her, trying to see if there was any trace of guilt on her face, any sign that she knew I'd caught her. But there was nothing. Just the same sweet smile she always gave me, like she hadn't just kissed another man. I stood in the living room, frozen, unable to process what had just happened. Emily looked so calm, so utterly normal, as if she hadn't just torn my heart out less than an hour ago. She sat cross-legged on the couch, scrolling through her phone, her face illuminated by the soft glow of the screen. "Everything okay?" she asked, her tone so casual it made my blood boil. I wanted to scream at her, demand answers, throw everything out in the open, but instead I just nodded. "Yeah," I mumbled, my voice barely audible. My head was spinning. This wasn't the time. Not yet. I needed to think, to figure out what the hell I was going to do. "Dinner smells great," she added, gesturing toward the takeout bag I'd left on the counter. "You really are the best." She smiled, and I almost believed it. Almost. But now, that smile felt like a mask, hiding the lies she'd been living behind my back. I sat down across from her, trying to act normal, but my mind was racing. Did Dylan know anything? Had he seen or heard something he shouldn't have? The thought made my stomach turn. I glanced toward his room, relieved to hear his soft snores. At least he was blissfully unaware, for now. Emily chatted about her day, filling the silence with stories about errands, a lunch date with her friend Sarah, and a funny thing Dylan said earlier. Every word felt like a dagger. How could she lie so effortlessly? Did she even feel guilty? Or had she done this so many times that it didn't even faze her anymore? I barely slept that night. Emily drifted off easily, curled up beside me as if nothing had changed. But everything had. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, replaying the scene in the taxi over and over in my mind. Her lips on his, the way she smiled at him, the way she smiled at me when I walked in tonight, like I was some fool who would never know. By morning, I had a plan. If Emily could lie to me so easily, then I could lie too. I needed answers, and I wasn't going to get them by confronting her head-on. Not yet. I decided to play dumb, to act like everything was fine, all while digging deeper into what was really going on. Over the next few days, I started paying closer attention to her. At first, it was subtle things. How often she checked her phone, the way she seemed to zone out during conversations. Then there were the times she ran errands but didn't bring anything back, or when she came home smelling like cologne that wasn't mine. I also started tracking her phone more often, trying to see if she returned to that quiet street, or if there were other places she visited that didn't add up. It wasn't long before I noticed a pattern. Every Thursday, like clockwork, she'd disappear for a few hours in the evening. Sometimes she said she was going to yoga, other times to visit Sarah. But her location always told a different story. One Thursday, I decided to follow her. I told her I'd be working late again, just like before. She kissed me on the cheek, grabbed her gym bag, and walked out the door, not suspecting a thing. I waited a few minutes before heading to my car, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. She drove across town and parked near a small diner. I watched from a distance as she walked inside. My heart was pounding. Was she meeting him here? Was this where they planned their little rendezvous? I waited for what felt like an eternity before she came back out, but she wasn't alone. It wasn't the taxi driver this time. It was another man, older, with graying hair and a business suit that looked a little too polished for this part of town. They didn't kiss, but there was something in the way they stood close, how he touched her arm, that set my blood boiling all over again. She got into his car, and they drove off together. I followed them to a hotel on the edge of the city. It wasn't a fancy place, but it wasn't a dive either. Somewhere in between, the kind of place that didn't ask too many questions. I parked across the street and watched as they walked inside, arm in arm. My vision blurred with rage. How many men had there been? How long had this been going on? For hours, I sat there in my car, staring at the hotel entrance, waiting for them to come back out. But as the minutes dragged on, my anger started to shift into something else. Sadness, betrayal, The weight of what I'd seen was suffocating. This wasn't just one mistake, one moment of weakness. This was a pattern, a choice she'd made over and over again. When they finally emerged, I snapped a few photos with my phone. I didn't know what I'd do with them yet, but I knew I needed proof. Proof for myself, for when I confronted her, for whatever came next. Back home, I barely had time to compose myself before Emily walked through the door. She looked tired but happy, like she'd had a fulfilling evening. "Yoga was great," she said, dropping her bag by the door. "I'm so glad you encouraged me to go." I forced a smile. "Of course," I said, my voice steady despite the storm raging inside me. "You deserve it." That night, as she slept beside me, I stared at the photos on my phone, trying to make sense of it all. I thought the taxi driver was bad enough, but now there was someone else. Who was this man? What did he mean to her? And more importantly, why? I knew I couldn't keep this charade up much longer, but before I confronted her, I needed to know the full truth. How deep did this go? How far was she willing to take it? And most importantly, was there anything left worth saving? The next day, I decided it was time to dig deeper. Emily had left for work like usual, kissing me on the cheek as if we were still the perfect couple. I couldn't stand her touch anymore, but I forced myself to play along. I waited until she was gone, then sat down at the kitchen table with my laptop. If she was as good at hiding things, there had to be more. People like her don't just slip up once and leave a trail. They get comfortable, careless. I was counting on that. I started with our shared accounts, banking, emails, anything I could think of. At first, everything looked normal. But then I noticed something odd, regular payments to a rideshare app, far more than what I'd expect for someone who barely used it. I checked the details, and sure enough, the times matched her yoga nights. My stomach tightened. Was she paying that taxi driver for more than just rides? Next, I checked her phone records. There was a number that showed up repeatedly, often late at night or during her errands. It wasn't saved under a name, just the digits, but I knew it wasn't a friend or family member. I called it, my heart racing as it rang. On the fourth ring, someone picked up. "Hello," a man's voice said, deep and unfamiliar. I froze. I didn't know what I expected, but hearing his voice made it real. My throat tightened. Without saying a word, I hung up. My hands were shaking. That had to be him. Was it the taxi driver? The guy from the hotel? Someone else entirely? The pieces weren't fitting together, and it was driving me insane. That evening, I tried to act normal around Emily, but it was getting harder. Every time she smiled at me, every time she laughed, I felt like I was being punched in the gut. I couldn't believe how easily she could pretend, how good she was at lying to my face. Around 8 p.m., her phone buzzed on the counter. She was in the shower, so I picked it up. The screen showed a notification from a messaging app one didn't recognize. I unlocked her phone. She never bothered to change the passcode and opened the app. My heart sank. There were dozens of messages, all from different men. Some were flirty, some were explicit, but they all told the same story. Emily wasn't just having an affair. She was juggling multiple. Some messages went back months, even years. There were photos, too. Pictures of her in outfits I'd never seen, taken in places I didn't recognize. One photo showed her in the back of a car, the same car I'd seen her in with the taxi driver. I felt sick. This wasn't a mistake. This wasn't something that just happened. Emily had built a secret life, one where I didn't exist except as a convenient cover. I slammed the phone down, my vision blurred with tears. When she came out of the shower, I was sitting at the kitchen table, her phone in front of me. She froze when she saw the look on my face. "What's wrong?" she asked, wrapping her towel tighter around herself. "Who's Mark?" I said, my voice shaking. Her face went pale. "Mark," she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "And Chris. And Steve. And whoever the hell drives that taxi you can't seem to stop riding in. I stood up, shoving the phone toward her. Don't even try to lie, Emily. I saw everything. Her eyes filled with tears, but I couldn't tell if it was guilt or just the shock of being caught. I can explain, she stammered. Explain what? I snapped. That you've been cheating on me for God knows how long. That our marriage meant nothing to you. That you're a liar. My voice was rising, and I didn't care. Dylan was at a sleepover, so there was no one here to protect from the truth. It's not what you think, she said, her voice trembling. I don't, I shouted, slamming my hand on the table. Don't insult me by trying to twist this around. I saw the messages, the photos. I saw you in that hotel, Emily, with him, and the taxi driver before that. Do you even know how many men you've been with? Or have you lost count? She broke down then, sinking into a chair as sobs racked her body. I'm sorry, she whispered over and over again, but her apologies didn't mean anything to me. Not anymore. Why? I asked, my voice quieter now but still filled with pain. Why would you do this? Was I not enough? Did you even love me? Or was this all just a game to you? She looked up at me, her eyes red and swollen. I do love you, she said, and I almost laughed at how ridiculous that sounded. I never wanted to hurt you. She hesitated. And I knew whatever came next was going to make things worse. You just what? I demanded. I needed something else, she said finally. I don't know how to explain it. I love you, but I felt trapped, like I was suffocating. And these other things, they made me feel alive again. Alive. I repeated, my voice filled with disbelief. You destroyed our family because you needed to feel alive? Do you even hear yourself right now? She didn't answer. She just sat there, crying, while I stood over her, feeling like my entire life had been a lie. I wanted to walk out, to leave her there and never look back. But then I thought about Dylan. What would this do to him? How could I explain this to him when I didn't even understand it myself? I turned and walked out of the room, slamming the door behind me. My heart was shattered. My mind was a mess, and I had no idea what to do next. The woman I thought I knew, the woman I'd built my life around, was a stranger, and I didn't know if I could ever trust her or anyone again. I spent the rest of that night in the guest bedroom, staring at the ceiling. My mind raced through everything Emily had said, every lie she had told, and every image I couldn't unsee. Her words echoed in my head. I needed to feel alive. What did that even mean? What was I supposed to do with that? It felt like she had handed me the wreckage of our life and expected me to piece it back together. But the more I thought about it, the more I realized I didn't want to. The next morning, I left before she woke up. Dylan was still at his friend's house, so I didn't have to explain why I was leaving the house in a rush. I drove aimlessly for hours, my emotions swinging between rage and despair. I thought about calling a friend, but I couldn't bear the thought of explaining what had happened. How do you even start that conversation? Hey, my wife has been sleeping with half the city. How's your morning? Eventually, I ended up at a park on the edge of town. It was quiet, the kind of place where no one would bother me. I sat on a bench overlooking a small pond, my head in my hands, trying to figure out what to do next. Divorce? Counseling? Pretend none of this had happened? Every option felt impossible. Then my phone buzzed. It was a text from Emily. We need to talk. Please come home. I'll explain everything. Explain everything. The words made my stomach churn. What was left to explain? I had seen enough, but part of me needed to hear it from her. I needed to know why she had done this, even if it wouldn't change anything. I took a deep breath and drove back home. When I walked in, Emily was sitting at the kitchen table, a cup of coffee in front of her. She looked like she hadn't slept. Her eyes were red and swollen, her hair a mess. For a moment, she looked up at me, and I saw a flicker of the woman I had fallen in love with all those years ago. But that image was quickly drowned out by the reality of who she had become. "Thank you for coming back," she said quietly. "Get to the point," I replied, my voice cold. I didn't want pleasantries or apologies. I wanted answers. She took a deep breath. "I know you hate me right now, and I don't blame you. But I need you to understand it wasn't just about you. It wasn't about us. It was about me. That's supposed to make it better." I snapped. "You cheated on me, Emily, with multiple men. You lied to me, to Dylan. Do you even realize what you've done?" Tears welled up in her eyes. "I know I hurt you. I know I ruined everything. But it wasn't because I didn't love you. I do love you, Jack. I don't know who I am anymore." "Stop," I said, holding up a hand. "I don't want excuses. I want the truth. How long has this been going on?" She hesitated, her hands trembling as she gripped her coffee cup. "The first time was 2 years ago," she admitted. It was just one night. But after that, it got easier to justify. I told myself it didn't mean anything, that it didn't affect us, but it did. And I knew it, but I couldn't stop. 2 years, I repeated, the weight of her confession hitting me like a freight train. "So every time you looked me in the eye, every time you kissed me, every time you said you loved me, you were lying?" "I wasn't lying about loving you," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was lying about everything else." I leaned back in my chair, trying to process her words. 2 years of betrayal. 2 years of living a lie. How had I been so blind? How had I not seen the signs? "Who are they?" I asked after a long silence. "The men. I want names." Her eyes widened in panic. "Jack, please." "I'm not asking," I interrupted. "I'm telling you. If you want me to even consider hearing you out, you tell me everything. Right now." She looked down at her hands, her face pale. "There's Mark, the taxi driver. And there's Peter, the guy from the hotel. And a couple of others. But they didn't mean anything. I swear. They didn't mean anything," I repeated bitterly. "You expect me to believe that? You built relationships with these people. You spent nights with them. You risked everything for them. And you want me to believe they didn't mean anything? I didn't think it would get this far," she said, her voice cracking. "I thought I could control it, that it was just a phase. But I was wrong. I know that now." I stood up, the chair scraping loudly against the floor. "You didn't think. That's the problem, Emily. You didn't think about me or Dylan or our family. You thought about yourself. And now we're all paying the price." "Jack, please," she pleaded, tears streaming down her face. "I'll do anything to fix this. Therapy, counseling, whatever it takes. Just don't give up on us." I looked at her, the woman I had loved for over a decade, and I felt nothing. No anger, no sadness, no love. Just emptiness. "I don't know if there's an us left to save," I said quietly. "You've taken everything we built and torn it apart. I don't know if I can ever trust you again." Her sobs filled the silence as I walked out of the room. I needed air, space, time to think. As I stood outside, the cold wind biting at my skin, I realized that no matter what happened next, nothing would ever be the same. The life I thought I had, the woman I thought I knew, it was all gone. The only question left was what I was going to do about it. I didn't go back into the house. I couldn't. Instead, I drove. Nowhere in particular, just away. Away from Emily. Away from the life I thought we had. Away from the suffocating weight of her betrayal. The car became a cocoon of isolation, the low hum of the engine drowning out the chaos in my mind. I couldn't stop thinking about Dylan. How could I shield him from this? How could I keep him from becoming collateral damage in the mess his mother had created? Eventually, I found myself in the parking lot of a small diner. It was the kind of place that stayed open all night, offering cheap coffee and a quiet corner to think. I ordered a cup and sat in a booth near the window, staring out at the dark street. As I stirred the coffee, my phone buzzed. For a moment, I thought about ignoring it, but something compelled me to check. It was a text from an unknown number. Asterisk, you don't know the whole story. Meet me at the park tomorrow at noon. Come alone. Asterisk. My heart pounded. Was this one of her lovers? A man who thought he owed me an explanation, or maybe a warning. Or was it Emily, trying to manipulate me with a burner phone? I stared at the screen, weighing my options. Ignoring the message seemed like the smartest move, but curiosity gnawed at me. What could they possibly say that would change anything? By morning, exhaustion had dulled my emotions. The diner waitress refilled my coffee 3 times before I finally decided to leave. I drove home, showered, and made myself presentable. Dylan was due back soon, and I wanted to at least look like I had things under control. Emily was still in the house, but we barely exchanged words. She was trying to act normal, but the tension was palpable. Neither of us mentioned the message. When noon approached, I told Emily I had errands to run and left. She didn't ask questions, just nodded silently. I drove to the park, my chest tight with apprehension. The lot was nearly empty, and I parked near a bench overlooking the pond. I didn't have to wait long. A man approached, his face familiar, but not immediately recognizable. He was tall, maybe mid-40s, with graying hair and a nervous energy. He sat down on the bench without a word, keeping a respectful distance. "You're Jack, right?" he finally asked. "Who are you?" I replied, my voice sharp. "Why are we here?" "My name is Stephen," he said. I guess you could say I'm part of this mess." I felt my pulse quicken. "Part of it how? Are you one of them?" "One of the men she—" "No," he interrupted, shaking his head. "It's not like that. I'm not here to defend her. But you need to know the truth." He paused, his gaze fixed on the pond. "Emily didn't just stumble into these affairs. Someone pushed her." "Pushed her?" I said, my voice dripping with disbelief. "What are you talking about?" He sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. "This started years ago. I was involved in a group. It's hard to explain, but we specialize in targeting people like Emily. Vulnerable, restless. We find their weak spots and exploit them." I stared at him, stunned. "What kind of group? What the hell are you saying?" "We call it emotional engineering," he admitted. "We create situations that drive people to make choices they wouldn't normally make. It's a game for most of us, a sick game. But for some, it's business. We're hired to ruin relationships, destroy reputations." Emily was a target. I felt like the ground had been ripped out from under me. "You're telling me someone hired you to do this to my wife, to my family?" He nodded, his face grim. At first, I thought it was just another job, but then I started to dig deeper. The person who hired us, they knew you. Personally, my mind raced. Who would hate me enough to orchestrate something like this? Who would go to such lengths to destroy my life? Who? I demanded, my voice shaking. "Who hired you?" Stephen hesitated, as if saying the name out loud would seal his fate. "It was your business partner," he finally said. "David." The air seemed to leave my lungs. David, the man I had trusted for years. The man I had built a company with, shared secrets with. Why? What could I have done to make him hate me this much? Why would he do this? I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. Stephen shrugged. "I don't know the full story. Maybe it's jealousy. Maybe it's money. But he paid a lot to make sure Emily's life unraveled in a way that would hurt you the most. The taxi driver, the hotel guy, they were all part of the setup. We planted them in her path. Gave her just enough temptation to push her over the edge. I felt sick. My hands clenched into fists as anger boiled inside me. And you went along with it. You destroyed my family for money. I didn't know it would go this far," he said, his voice filled with regret. "I left the group months ago, but I couldn't stop thinking about your case. That's why I reached out. You deserve to know the truth. I stood up, my entire body trembling. Stay the hell away from me and my family, I spat. If I ever see you again, you won't, he said, standing as well. But think carefully about your next move, Jack. David isn't someone to take lightly. He's dangerous. I didn't respond. I turned and walked back to my car, my mind spinning. The betrayal felt like it had multiplied tenfold. Emily's actions were still unforgivable, but now they were part of something bigger, something darker. David had turned my life into a twisted game, and I had been playing without even realizing it. As I drove home, a plan began to form in my mind. I wasn't just going to confront David. I was going to expose him. Everything he had done, every secret he had hidden, I would bring it all to light. This wasn't just about Emily anymore. This was about taking back control of my life. When I walked into the house, Emily was sitting on the couch, her eyes puffy from crying. She looked up at me, hope flickering in her gaze. "Jack," she started, but I held up a hand to stop her. "Not now," I said. "We're not done, but there's something I need to take care of first." I didn't give her a chance to respond. I went to the office, grabbed my laptop, and started gathering everything I could on David. Emails, financial records, anything that could tie him to this scheme. If he wanted to play games, he'd picked the wrong opponent. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The next morning, I woke up with a single goal, to dismantle the life of the man who had orchestrated the destruction of mine. David. The name alone made my blood boil. Every interaction, every handshake, every toast we'd made over years of working together felt poison now. The betrayal wasn't just personal. It was calculated. He had played me, and he'd used Emily as a pawn. I spent hours in my office, going through every piece of information I could find. I reviewed financial records, email chains, and even old meeting notes. David and I had always split responsibilities. He managed the partnerships while I handled operations. It was a perfect arrangement for him to hide things in plain sight. And there it was, buried deep in the files. A series of payments to an obscure consulting firm that Stephen had mentioned in passing. A quick search revealed it wasn't a legitimate company. It was a front, likely for the group that Stephen had been a part of. David had paid them over 6 figures to ruin my life. It wasn't just the money, though. David had been siphoning off profits from the business for years. Small amounts at first, then larger ones once he thought no one was looking. He wasn't just trying to destroy me personally. He was robbing me blind. I printed out everything, every fraudulent transaction, every suspicious payment, every email that hinted at his deception. By the time I was done, I had a mountain of evidence. But I wasn't just going to confront him. I was going to ensure he couldn't escape the consequences. Emily knocked on the office door as I was finishing up. Her eyes were swollen, her face pale. She looked like she hadn't slept. "Jack," she said softly, "can we talk?" I didn't look up. "Not now, Emily." Her voice trembled. "Please. I know you hate me, but I need to tell you something." I finally turned to face her. What could you possibly say that would make this better? She stepped into the room, clutching a folded piece of paper in her hand. "I didn't know how to tell you this before, but I got a letter from Stephen, too. Yesterday, he said I should give this to you." I froze. "You've been hiding this?" "No," she said quickly. I was scared. I didn't know what to do. But after everything, I think you need to see it. She handed me the paper, and I unfolded it. Stephen's handwriting was scrawled across the page, messy and urgent. "Asterisk, Jack, if you're reading this, it means I didn't have time to explain everything in person. David isn't just trying to ruin you. He's trying to erase you. The affairs were just the beginning. He wants control of the business, and he's willing to destroy your reputation to get it. Be careful. He's more dangerous than you realize. Watch your back." Asterisk. My stomach turned. Erase me? Was that why David had done this? To take over the company? Or was there something more? The thought that my own business partner would go to such lengths was nauseating, but it also clarified my next steps. I looked up at Emily. "Why didn't you give me this sooner?" "I was scared," she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't think you believed me after everything I've done." I shook my head. "You should have trusted me. But it doesn't matter now. I have what I need." "What are you going to do?" she asked, her voice trembling. "I'm going to end this," I said, my tone cold. "And I don't care what it costs." That afternoon, I called David. My voice was steady, controlled. "We need to meet," I said. "Something's come up at the office, and I need your input." He didn't hesitate. "Of course." "When?" "Now," I said. At the office. When I arrived, he was already there, sitting at the conference table with his usual smug grin. He looked up as I walked in, his face carefully neutral. "What's this about?" he asked. I dropped the folder of evidence on the table. "This," his smile faltered. "What's all this?" "Your lies," I said. "Your theft. Your pathetic attempt to ruin my life." He leaned back in his chair, his expression shifting from surprise to amusement. "Jack, I don't know what you think you found, but—" "Cut the act, David," I snapped. "I know everything. The fake consulting firm, the payments, the group you hired to target Emily. I even know about the money you've been stealing from the company." His face hardened. "You don't have proof." I opened the folder and slid the documents toward him. "Really? Because this looks like proof to me." He flipped through the papers, his jaw tightening with each page. "You don't want to do this, Jack." "Do what?" I asked, leaning forward. "Expose you for the liar and thief you are? Make sure everyone knows exactly what kind of man you are?" "Oh, I absolutely want to do this." David's eyes narrowed. "You're making a mistake." "No, David," I said, standing up. "The mistake was trusting you. The mistake was letting you get close enough to stab me in the back. But don't worry. I'm going to fix that." I walked out of the room before he could respond, my heart pounding. The next few hours were a blur of phone calls and meetings. I contacted my lawyer, the board of directors, and even the police. By the end of the day, David's accounts were frozen, and the authorities were investigating his fraudulent activities. It wasn't enough to just expose him. I wanted him to pay for everything he'd done. That night, I sat in the living room, exhausted but relieved. Emily came in, her expression tentative. "Is it over?" she asked. "Almost," I said. "He won't be able to hurt us anymore." She nodded, sitting down across from me. "I'm sorry, Jack, for everything. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I just wanted you to know." I looked at her, the woman I had once loved more than anything, and felt a pang of sadness. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Emily, but I do know that this, what David did, wasn't your fault." Tears welled up in her eyes. "Thank you." As she left the room, I realized that this was just the beginning of a long road. Rebuilding my life, repairing the damage to my family. It would take time. But for the first time in weeks, I felt a sense of clarity. I had lost so much, but I hadn't lost everything. And I wasn't going to let David or anyone else take anything more from me. In the weeks that followed, everything began to fall into place, albeit slowly and with considerable effort. David was arrested after the police concluded their investigation. The evidence I had gathered was more than enough to secure his conviction. His smug arrogance was finally replaced with a look of sheer panic as the handcuffs clicked around his wrists. Justice had been served, and I could finally breathe a little easier knowing he was out of our lives. Emily, on the other hand, was a different story. Her pain was raw, and for the first time, I saw just how deeply she had been manipulated. As more details came to light, it became clear that the group David had hired hadn't just preyed on her vulnerabilities. They had actively coerced her. Stephen's revelations confirmed that they had even used hypnotic techniques, subtle psychological conditioning, and targeted emotional triggers to break her resolve. Emily was a victim in every sense of the word. When she confessed this to me in a tearful conversation, the guilt in her voice was overwhelming. I felt like I was losing control of myself, she said, clutching her hands tightly in her lap. It's like they rewired my brain, Jack. I didn't even recognize myself anymore. Hearing her say that shattered the wall of anger I'd built around my heart. For so long, I had only seen her as a betrayer. Now, I saw her as someone who had been used, stripped of her agency, and thrown into chaos she couldn't navigate. She wasn't blameless. There were choices she made that hurt me deeply, but she had been fighting a battle far bigger than either of us understood. Emily decided to seek therapy, not just to address her guilt, but to unravel the damage those people had done to her mind. She committed to rebuilding herself, and I could see her determination. She attended every session religiously, learning to understand the mechanisms of manipulation she had been subjected to and how to heal from them. She even joined a support group for victims of coercive control, where she found solidarity and strength in others who had been through similar ordeals. For my part, I started going to therapy too, though it wasn't an easy decision. I had to confront the bitterness and anger I'd been carrying and figure out how to process everything. Slowly, I began to understand that forgiveness wasn't just for Emily. It was for me. Letting go of the resentment didn't mean forgetting what happened, but it meant allowing myself the freedom to move forward. We also started couples counseling. It was awkward at first, the silence between us heavy with unspoken pain. But session by session, we began to open up. We talked about things we hadn't addressed in years, the cracks in our marriage that had made us vulnerable to someone like David. It was exhausting, painful work, but it was also healing. Dylan remained our priority through it all. We shielded him from as much of the chaos as we could, focusing instead on giving him a sense of stability. Emily poured herself into being the best mother she could be, and I did the same as a father. For the first time in a long time, we worked as a team. There were no instant fixes. Trust isn't rebuilt overnight, and the scars of what happened will always be a part of our story. But as we sat together one evening, watching Dylan play with his toys, I realized something. Emily wasn't the enemy. She never had been. She had been a victim of forces far beyond her control, manipulated into a position where she couldn't see a way out. And despite everything, she was fighting to make things right. "I'm sorry," she said quietly, breaking the comfortable silence. For everything, for not being strong enough to see through what they were doing to me. I reached for her hand, something I hadn't done in months. "You were strong enough to survive it," I said. "And that's more than I can say for most people. We'll get through this." Together, for the first time in what felt like an eternity, her smile reached her eyes. It wasn't perfect, and it wasn't easy, but it was real. And that was enough for now.